It's an enormous privilege to have been asked to contribute to this conference on St. John Damascene in honour of Dr. Norman Russell, whose light has for too long been hidden under the bushel often bestowed on an independent scholar. His research on the Greek fathers, notably Theophilus of Alexandria, his nephew Cyril, and more recently on Gregory Palamas, and now on John Damascene, as well as his research constituting a golden thread through the tradition, his research on deification constituting a golden thread through tradition is, let us say, of peerless quality. But to turn to St. John Damascene, the translation of his most important and certainly most influential prose work on the Orthodox faith by Norman Russell forms the precise focus for this colloquy. I also want to express my gratitude, not only for his scholarship, but for his having dedicated this very fine translation to me. After the discussion of God, the Trinity, and how we're to speak about God and his attributes in On the Orthodox Faith, there follows what seems to me a transitional chapter on Aeon, chapter 15, before the Damascene embarks on a long series of chapters concerned with the created order, invisible, that is, on angels, the devil and demons, and visible on the five elements, leading into another transitional chapter, 25, on paradise, before going on to discuss at some length the nature of the human, taking on up to chapter 44. It is the chapters concerned with creation and the five elements that I want to consider inevitably briefly this afternoon or morning, whenever it is. The created order is divided into the invisible and the visible, each prefaced by a chapter on creation. Perithymioias, chapter 16, and then Perikatisios Oratis, on fashioning or creation, and on visible creation. Both these chapters underline the doctrine of creation out of nothing, but do so in significantly different ways. First, chapter 16. Since therefore God, who is good and beyond goodness, was not satisfied with contemplation of himself, but through excess of goodness was well pleased that those things that would benefit from his goodness and partake of it should come into being, drawing them from non-being into being, and fashioning the whole universe, the Tasimpanda, invisible and visible, as well as the human consisting of both the visible and the invisible. He creates by conceiving intellectually, and in the intelligible concept consists as a work brought to completion by the word and perfected by the Spirit. And chapter 19, after the discussion of the invisible creation, our God himself, who is glorified in triad and monad, or if you prefer, Trinity and unity, made the heaven and the earth and everything in them, drawing the whole of everything, again Tasimpanda, from non-being into being, making such things as heaven, earth, air, fire, water, but not out of matter that was, making such things as heaven, earth, air, fire, water, but not out of matter that was pre-existent, and out of them, which are come into being through him, making such things as living beings, plants and seeds. For these things are come into being from earth and water, air and fire, through the command of the Creator. These chapters are worth a couple of comments. First, the way he expresses the doctrine of creation out of nothing. In both cases, he talks of drawing paragi or paragon, things from non-being into being, ektumiondos is to ine, which is the language used, for instance, in the prayer of the Tritsagion, in the Anaphora, and in the prayer after the Lord's Prayer in the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, save that the last prayer has ex ukondon instead of ex tumiondos. Also, it's worth noticing too, the parallel I've drawn with the language of liturgical prayer is not arbitrary. It is invited by the Damascene's own language, both the way in which both chapters begin. God, who is good and beyond goodness, was not satisfied with contemplation of himself, but through excess of goodness, and so on. disowning Aristotle's noesis noesios, and evoking the language of the Areopagite, redolent as it is with liturgical cadences. And in chapter 19, which echoes a strikingly liturgical invocation of God as triad and monad in one of Gregory the Theologian's much quoted orations, oration 25. The theological language used in the Greek tradition before the Damascene displays a great deal more variety. Secondly, in chapter 19, like Athanasius in his De Incarnatione, the Damascene makes explicit that God did not make the universe out of pre-existent matter, adding, as Athanasius does not, that the five elements are the source of all else created. My impression is that for most of the fathers, outside commentary on the Exaimeron, that is all that is said about creation until the human creation is considered. Creation means creation out of nothing. But the Damascene seems to be interested in what has been created, in the 5 or 4 elements of creation itself. And it is the deliberation with which this is asserted that strikes me, together with the chapters that follow, explicitly discussing each of the elements, heaven or the sky, light or fire, air and winds, waters, and finally the earth and what comes from it. Now, where does all this come from? It is, of course, a long story, as long as you like to make it, for speculation about what the cosmos consists of goes back to the very beginnings of Greek thought, back even beyond the philosophers, to the poets, Homer and Hesiod. But I don't want to go back that far, fascinating as it is, save to note that the first clear assertion of the 4 elements is generally held to be by the philosopher-poet Parmenides, who asserts in his On Opinion, the counterpart to his On Truth, here first the 4 roots of all things, bright Zeus, life-bringing Hera, Aidonios, and Nestis, whose tears are the source of mortal streams. Later, around 60 years later, having quoted these verses from Parmenides, Empedocles identifies these 4 roots with fire, air, water, and earth. What is curious, reading through modern accounts of the development of thought about the elements, is that the notion of the 4 elements gets rather lost in a thicket of discussion of ways of undermining this, atoms and such like, which are presented as the real elements of the cosmos. But this rather disguises the remarkable fact that the notion of the 4 elements of the cosmos held sway for more than 2 millennia and has still not altogether lost its appeal. It is not likely, I think, that the Damascene was very deeply informed about ancient Greek discussion of the elements, though he would likely have been aware of the discussion in Plato's Timaeus, which was unquestionably the most important cosmological treatise in late antiquity and beyond. He would have known to the writings of the fathers, not least St. Basil's Exaimeron. It is also certain that he knew Nemesius's De Natura Hominis, for he makes good use of it later on in the Expositio Fidei. Indeed, chapter 19 of the Expositio Fidei could be regarded as a summary of section 5 of De Natura Hominis, where Nemesius too affirms that the 4 elements are the fundamental building blocks of the cosmos created by God. But if it is John's source, he has radically curtailed it, for Nemesius goes on to discuss how the elements are related one with another, something that John largely takes for granted, though he's familiar with it. It's probably Basil who we need to look at before going on to the Damascene. There is little explicit discussion of the elements in Basil's Exaimeron. He doesn't, like the Damascene, make it clear that God created the elements first and then out of them everything else. But the elements crop up from time to time. In the first homily, there is an interesting discussion of the nature of heaven, Urania physis. Basil says that some think that the heaven is made out of the 4 elements, since they are known by touch, they are apton, or by sight, oraton. For heaven participates in earth by resistance, in fire by visibility, and in air and water by a mixture of touch and sight. Another possibility is that the heaven is composed of a fifth bodily element, to aetherion soma, which is derived neither from fire, nor from air, nor from earth, nor from water. And in support of this, it is said that the four bodily elements move in a straight line, whereas the movement of the heavens is circular. Basil comes to no conclusion, letting the two schools of thought fight it out among themselves, as it were. For ourselves, he says, let us believe Moses, who told us that God created the heaven and the earth, and let us glorify the supreme craftsman who brought all into being wisely and skillfully. In passing, it's curious that Basil has no opinion on this, given that Origen in De Principiis asserts that the faith of the church does not accept the view of certain Greek philosophers that there is, besides the body, which is composed of four elements, another fifth body, which is entirely other than and different from our present body. This in the unusual context of the nature of the resurrection body. In the fourth element, in the fourth homily on the gathering together of the waters, Basil comes back to talk about the elements and correlates the elements with the sensations of hot and cold, dry and wet. Nemesius' section 5, already referred to, goes into this in detail, expounding the views of all the philosophers. Earth is dry and cold, water is wet and cold, air is hot and wet, fire is hot and dry. And furthermore, this means that there is a relationship between the elements. Earth, dry and cold, is linked to fire by its dryness and water by its coldness. Water is linked to air and fire, air and earth. Air is linked to fire and water, fire to air and earth. They therefore constitute a circle. Earth, water, air, fire, and back to earth again. A harmonious circle and dance, as Basil puts it, kyklos ke choros en harmonios. What is the Damascene to say about the five elements one by one? The first element he calls heaven, uranos. The normal word for the fifth element is aether, which John uses a couple of times and seems to identify with fire. The principal reason for John's use of heaven is presumed in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth, which is echoed in the first article of the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed. Pistevo en theon patera pantocratera pietin uranu keis. Heaven, he tells us, is the perimeter, the periochi, of visible and invisible creatures. For within it, the intelligent powers of the angels and everything perceived by the senses are enclosed and delimited. Only the divine is uncircumscribed, filling everything and containing everything and setting a limit to everything as being beyond all and creating all. He then goes on to say that the scriptures speak of the heaven of heaven, the heaven of heavens, and mention St. Paul the Apostle being caught up to the third heaven. And he says that we consider as heavens what the wise from outside call the starless sphere, making their own the teaching of Moses. The chapter then goes on to discuss the waters in relation to the firmament, the way in which the heavens revolve with the heavier elements at the center and the lighter ones towards the perimeter. The Damascene also introduced the 7 zones or planetary spheres of the heavens, to each of which is assigned one of the 7 planets: Sun, Moon, Jupiter, Mercury, Mars, Venus, and Saturn, to use the Latin names that we in the West are familiar with. He explains that some people think that the heavens cover the earth like a hemispherical tent or curtain, a veris. This passage is dependent largely on Severus of Gabala, although the most famous example of this is to be found in Cosmas Indicopleustis, Christian topography, manuscripts of which often have wonderful illustrations of his flat earth with a conical mountain to the north, behind which the sun goes during the night. John of Damascus gives this as a possible account of the cosmos, citing in support the scriptural texts on which it depends. Psalm 103 verse 2 and Isaiah 40 verse 22. But it seems to me, from the rest of his discussion, that he silently puts it on one side. After the chapter on heaven, there follow 4 chapters on the 4 elements as normally understood: fire, air, water, and earth. Fire, or to be complete, on light, fire, and the luminaries, the sun, the moon, and the stars. Fire, one of the 4 elements, it is light and more inclined to ascend than the rest, burning and radiant, Patristic, created by the Creator on the first day. Day comes first, for the darkness of night is the privation of light. Nevertheless, John quotes Genesis 1:5, there was evening and there was morning, day 1. This is much the longest, and this chapter on the Orthodox faith is much the longest chapter, full of a great deal of astronomical and astrological detail, signs of the zodiac, the houses of the stars, the seasons, how these correspond to the elements, winter being cold and wet, spring being warm and wet, and so on. Several sections here and elsewhere are introduced by what I think seems to me a characteristic phrase of John of Damascus, particularly on the Orthodox faith. Cride Yenoskin, or sometimes cride idenni. It is necessary to know. As an example, he tells us that it is necessary to know that the moon was created by the Creator complete, that is 15 days old, for it is appropriate for it to come into being fully formed. On the 4th day, as we have said, the sun was created. It therefore anticipates, the moon therefore anticipates the sun by 11 days, for from the 4th to the 15th day is 11 days, and therefore in time, the 12 lunar elements lack 11 days compared with 12 solar months, and so on. Air, or on air and winds, it's a brief chapter, it's a lighter element, wet and warm, heavier than fire, lighter than earth and water, colorless, transparent, and serves 3 of our senses: sight, hearing, smell. Wind is the movement of the air, and place belongs to air. On water, or on waters in the plural, there are waters both above and below the firmament. There are rivers, the ocean surrounding the earth, and the 4 rivers flowing from paradise, the Ganges, the Nile, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. Water, he says, is the best element, useful in many ways and cleansing of stains, not only bodily, but of soul too, if there is added the grace of the Spirit. It seems to me that though John is very concise about water, he may well have known the great prayer of the blessing of the waters composed by St. Sophronius of Jerusalem, probably 50 years or so before John was born. Great are you, O Lord, and wonderful are your works, and no word will be adequate to sing the praise of your wonders. For as by your will you brought the universe from non-existence into being, by your might you uphold creation, and by your providence you direct the world. From 4 elements you composed the world, with 4 seasons you crowned the circle of the year. And a bit later, you set at liberty the generations of our nature. You sanctified a virgin womb by your birth. All creation sang your praise when you appeared, for you, our God, were seen on earth and lived among mortals. You also sanctified the streams of Jordan by sending down to them from heaven your all-Holy Spirit, and you crushed the heads of the dragons that lurked there. Therefore, O King, lover of mankind, be present now too, through the visitation of your Holy Spirit, and sanctify this water. And do you, Master of all things, declare this water to be water of redemption, water of sanctification, cleansing of flesh and spirit, untying of bonds, forgiveness of offences, enlightenment of soul, washing of rebirth, renewal of spirit, gift of adoption, garment of incorruption, source of life. For it was you, Lord, who said, wash and be made clean, and put away evils from your soul. It is you who have given us the grace of rebirth from on high through water and the Spirit. And then finally, earth, or on earth and what is from it. It is, John says, a fundamental element. It's mentioned in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Everything comes from the earth, plants, animals, and even humans in some sense. Some say that the earth is spherical, some that it is conical. Now, what is John doing in these chapters? Cotter's references to sources are extremely patchy. There are a few references to Basil and Severus, occasionally to Nemesius, but most of his references are cross-references to other works of the Damascene. Why are they there? Is it John Damascene's desire to be encyclopedic? I think that seems to me to be an answer of desperation. Perhaps, and this is leading on to what I'm going to say later, perhaps the key is to be found in the brief passage from Basil's first homily on the Exaimeron, a discussion in which it says, as we've seen, that the elements are only, a discussion in which what he says about the elements is only said en passant. The elements are known, he says, as we've seen, by touch and sight. The Damascene spends so much time on the elements because it is through them that we know the cosmos. We touch it, we see it. It is something familiar, though not something domesticated. Here, if you like, is no hergestellte Welt, to use an expression of Jungel's that once struck me. John's cosmos is not fashioned by man, not technologized, as we have so made it. Nevertheless, it is familiar. It is composed of elements that we know and that have meaning. Indeed, I think one can go further. For John, as for the fathers in general, the cosmos has been fashioned for humankind. The human comes last on the scene, a scene that has been set for him, which is why the discussion of paradise in chapter 25 acts as a transitional chapter to the consideration of the human. Furthermore, the human is not just part of the visible world. As we noted in chapter 16 on creation, the Damascene makes the point that God created the whole of everything, ta sympanda, invisible and visible, and the human composed both the visible and invisible. The human is on a frontier, or the frontier, methoria, a word used very much used, always in the plural, by Nemesius, but not, as far as I can see, by Damascene himself. The human is on a frontier between the visible and the invisible, and this in virtue of being in the image, and as such is a little cosmos, mikros cosmos. And beyond that, the elements seem to contain meaning for John, contain meaning for John. They signify something. They, as it were, contain the simple wisdom of God expressed as the polypikilos sophia, wisdom in all its variety of the universe, Ephesians 3:10. And the very word that he uses for universe, ta sympanda, regularly, borrowing the term from Psalm 103, verse 28, seems to me to express a sense of cosmic sympathy, a sense that the cosmos is all united, all the parts of the cosmos are united with one another, and which is also conveyed by the mutual relatedness of the elements. Not only did John set out in patient detail the place of the elements in ta sympanda, but it seems that some of his readers were keen to add further details, not least the lists of winds, lakes, and provinces of the empire. See what are called in Cotter's edition, chapters 22b, 23b, and 24b. Now, what is the point of all this? Surely some would say that the notions of the four elements are just a piece of outmoded science, completely replaced now by atoms and their constituents, protons, neutrons, and electrons, if not by strings, or whatever the latest theory may be. Maybe. And there have been and are many who would think so. And there's a very well-known at least in the English-speaking world, and striking example in Sir Arthur Eddington's book, once popular book, The Nature of the Physical World. In the introduction, he starts like this: I have settled down to the task of writing these lectures and have drawn up my two chairs to my two tables. Two tables, yes, there are replicas, everything about me. Two tables, two chairs, two pens. This is not a very profound beginning to a course which ought to reach the transcendent levels of scientific philosophy. But we cannot touch bedrock immediately. We must scratch a bit at the surface of things first. And when I begin to scratch at the first thing I strike, and whenever I begin to scratch at the first thing I strike, is my two tables. One of them has been familiar to me from earliest years. It is a commonplace object of that environment that I call the world. How shall I describe it? It has extension, it is comparatively permanent, it is colored, above all, it is substantial. And by substantial, I do not merely mean that it does not clap when I lean on it. I mean it is constituted of substance, and by that word I am trying to convey to you some conception of its intrinsic nature. It is a thing, not like space, which is a mere negation, or like time, which is God knows what, and so on, in a bluff, common sense way. And he continues to introduce the second table. Table number 2 is my scientific table. It is a more recent acquaintance, and I do not feel so familiar with it. It does not belong to the world previously mentioned, that world which spontaneously appears around me when I open my eyes, though how much of it is objective and how much subjective, I do not here consider. It is part of a world which in more devious ways has forced itself upon my attention. My scientific table is mostly emptiness. Sparsely scattered in that emptiness are numerous electric charges rushing about with great speed, but their combined bulk amounts to less than a billionth of the bulk of the table itself. Notwithstanding its strange construction, it turns out to be an entirely efficient table. It supports my writing paper as satisfactory table number 1. For when I lay my paper on it, the little electronic particles, with their headlong speed, keep on hitting the underside so that the paper is maintained in shuttlecock fashion at a nearly steady level, and so on. Now, what's wrong with this? First of all, it seems to me Eddington undermines himself. For if his account of the scientific table is true, then what is this picture based on? His answer will presumably be on careful and verifiable scientific experiment, but that means that it's based on human experience, however specialized and however controlled, so as to avoid personal bias. In fact, actually, my own experience of my table, the ones I'm sitting at, might well be very personal. A desk on which I've written so much, which has been with me in a way as I've struggled with ideas and tried to express them. I might get very attached to the table and find myself lost if sitting at an unfamiliar table in an unfamiliar room. All these personal associations, scientific observation is trying to ignore or bypass, so as to arrive at a universally accepted and objective account of what it is we see and perceive. One might think that such a procedure is robbing our experience of everything that matters, but it is nevertheless experience on which scientific observation is based, and the theories that scientists come up with are intended to account for that experience. But the way Eddington grants priority to the world as imagined through his understanding of atomic theory, as it then was, is not a world he experiences at all. It is an imaginative construction of the kind of mathematical explanation of a world consisting of atoms composed of protons, neutrons, and electrons, and so forth. But the basis of this imaginative construction is what we see and perceive. And Eddington's prioritizing table number 2 over table number 1 rejects what we experience in favor of something we don't experience as such, but seems to be demanded by the specialized experience of a laboratory. I'm not suggesting that Eddington's table number 2 is nonsense, though maybe it is considerably outdated now. But that the process of thought that leads from our ordinary experience to atomic theory starts from our ordinary experience. And if we undermine that, as Eddington seems to be doing, if we have undermined our empirical starting point, and insofar as Eddington is telling us about the atomic structure of solid objects, it should not be understood as undermining our experience, but providing an explanation of certain features that we experience, in particular those that can be subject to measurement. And there is something else. Eddington explicitly makes the point that he finds the world to which his table number 2 belongs strange and unfamiliar. Indeed, and I expect that this is not just the strangeness of a new way of looking at things, but something more fundamental. It seems to me that to replace our experience of the world with a scientific theory entails a world in which we can never feel at home, for it deprives us of any points of contact, any familiar landmarks. And this seems to be part of the story of our understanding the world in which we live, a story that maybe began in the Western Middle Ages, but has progressed apace since the comprehensive revision of the way we understand the world, associated at the beginning with the names of Francis Bacon and René Descartes. From an understanding of the world in which the human was conceived of as standing on the frontiers of the universe, between the spiritual and the material, between the uncreated and the created, as constituting in himself or herself a little cosmos, a microcosm, to use the word fashioned by Renaissance philosophers from suggestions in classical philosophy, and being himself syndesmos to cosmo, the bond of the cosmos. We have moved to an understanding of the world as quantitative, a thing or things to be measured and observed, as it were, from the outside, as if we were not part of the world. Some of the advances in physics in the last century, such as the uncertainty principle and quantum mechanics, put question marks against such an approach, but do not necessarily call the whole approach into question, but rather simply suggest limits to our understanding of what it is we observe. The traditional understanding of the world that John Damascene presents us with, a world constituted of the 4 elements, is a world made up of elements we are familiar with, and furthermore, elements that themselves have meaning. They are not just limited to their being measurable entities. And there really is no reason to abandon this sense of the world we live in and experience as So there's no reason to abandon this sense that the world we live in and experience is constituted by the elements of fire, air, water, and earth. One might recall in passing something I mentioned earlier, that in antiquity, where the notion of the 4 or 5 elements from which everything is constituted held sway, alongside this, there was speculation about the underlying constituents of the world, reducing the elements to one of them, or revealing an underlying logos, reason or principle, or some kind of perpetual interchange governed by opposing principles, such as love and strife. Now, what I'd like to do now, but there's no time, in the concluding part of this lecture, would be to explore something of what could be meant by a world conceived of in terms of the traditional elements. But I fear that this would not be the concluding part of a lecture, but perhaps more realistically, the rest of a lecture course. And what I have in mind is very tentative. I mean, bits have been worked out, but only in a very provisional way. And the sort of things I would go on to do would be to draw on the 5 books by the French philosopher Gaston Bachelard on the 4 elements, there being 2 books on earth, which he treats last. And also one could draw on, for instance, perhaps likely to be closer to home, namely the way in which T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets are structured, so it seems to me, around the 4 elements. But all this must be for a future occasion. Thank you for your patience.